As we all know, the environment and climate crisis poses an existential threat to humanity. Over the last 4 to 5 decades, there's been a concerted effort by the government and industry to tackle this crisis via the signing of international agreements as well as domestic policy reforms. But the environment faces a plethora of challenges in addition to climate change, and the first step in understanding any of them is to educate and then be educated of the myriad issues confronting the environment today. Towards this end, there is no one in this country who is a bigger authority and champion on environmental education than Kartikeya Sarabhai. Mr. Sarabhai is a winner of the illustrious Padma Shri award in 2012 for his efforts in environmental education. And, safe to say that he is one of the world's leading environmental educators. He's a dedicated community builder and, he's also an astute and well-regarded industrialist. He is the founder and director of India's Center for Environmental Education, which is headquartered in Ahmedabad and has offices across the country. The organization received the Global Award for Outstanding Service to Environmental Education from the North American Association for Environmental Education. And Mr. Sarabhai is also a trustee of the famous Sarabhai ashram in Ahmedabad. I'm so stoked to have him today on Swell. It was short notice and Mr. Sarabhai has gracefully agreed to chat with me on the Think Tank Swellcast. This is Karan Dev, and Mr. Sarabhai, thank you so much again for giving me the chance to interview you really on Swell. I wanted to start this off by asking you, briefly, how the journey's been thus far. Now, I know that's a complex question, but if you could sort of summarize, the center's work, how it's evolved, and what are the challenges that you continue to face today?
The Ministry of Environment was formed in 84, and it was in that same year that many of us who were working on education as a means of doing change really had argued that one of the pillars of India's strategy to transform itself to a more sustainable society has to be education. And by education, we didn't only mean formal education, but we also meant public awareness. We meant communities learning about how to deal in environmental crisis, how to work towards a positive environment. We talked about working with industry, working with policymakers. So this was the objective with which C started in 84. And over the years, we've been working nationally, wonderful new programs. Many of these ideas which at that time seemed new and other things have now gone into the system. Today we are working on other ideas on education. We have direct contact with several villages. We work with industry and schools and others. So it's a long story, and maybe a little later in the chat we can go into some of the details.
It really has been a remarkable story since its inception, sir. And, before we circle back to the work of the center, India was the third largest emitter of carbon dioxide by volume in 2020. And, the government's made pledges to the UN in its fight against climate change. It's been given a term, and it's called the Nationally Determined Contribution, or NDC. And as per the promise, India pledged to reduce carbon emissions intensity by 45% of GDP by 2030. How realistic has the government's pledges been on this front, sir? And, taking into account the Paris Agreement and, the other areas that India has kind of negotiated with the UN on, how have we fared in our journey in combating climate change thus far?
Karan, the figure you gave, which is that India is the third largest emitter of carbon dioxide, has to be seen along with the size of its population. So it's very easy to say that India is a major producer of carbon dioxide, but when you take it on a per capita basis, in fact, India is not the third, it is way behind most developing countries. So I don't think it is correct to correct to just take the gross figure. Even if you take the fact that India and China's population is roughly the same today, India is in fact going to overtake it in the current year, then also the total emission of China at its stage of development and India is far less. So India's challenge is that we do want for all our citizens to develop rapidly, economically, and at the same time keep doing it in a very responsive way so that our carbon emission does not increase. The Prime Minister has given very ambitious targets, and I would say that these are ambitious but are achievable. And I think as a result of those targets, I think India is working hard to see that our development strategy actually goes on a different path from being imitative of the way in which the West developed. Now that does not mean that we will stop producing from coal, for instance, overnight. We really cannot afford that. We do have to have more efficient coal plants, but it will not immediately go. But at the same time, we've placed a major thrust in terms of solar and wind energy, and that is the way we are going. Efficiencies, which you mentioned, the carbon intensity of growth. Now there also I think we are doing reasonably well in terms of what we are going to achieve. So I think that the targets are achievable. One of the problems in that is that some of our actions are not coordinated with the climate thinking. So we still continue to do actions which contradict what other departments of the same government are doing. And I think we do need to clean up that. We need to say that while we go forward, we don't go backwards in certain areas. For instance, we have to think of the way we will urbanize. And if we again urbanize exactly like the West and keep it very car dependent, there is no way that it will be viable in the future. So we do need to have an alternate strategy where we obviously want to avoid the type of pollution issues which are coming in Delhi, for instance, and other cities. We do want more pedestrian and non-motorized transport. We do want our public transport systems to be such that most citizens find it viable and fine to go in public transport rather than necessarily relying on cars, but a different type of model. And I think India is very well set to be able to evolve a model for sustainability, which is perhaps unique in the world. But we need to work very hard for it, and there are lots of forces which are actually taking us towards just being an imitative consumer society and move towards fossil fuel-based development. So I think that is the challenge.
As an industrialist yourself, sir, what do you make of the government's push towards renewable energy and adopting sustainable modes of power generation? Because a lot of big companies are entering into this sphere, and I think renewable energy has been a key initiative that a lot of companies have undertaken over the last 5 years. So are there any underlying dangers when massive corporations enter the sphere, and what do you make of this new push by the government?
Renewable energy and the push which we are giving with large companies is good, because you will have to produce at that end. But you must understand that renewable energy is something which can also be done in a very decentralized way. And I think the push needs to be seen in both of those. For instance, household solar powers, so that each consumer, if you like, in a city is also a producer of electricity and contributes to the grid and can use something. Or similarly in villages, you could have microgrids where people use it. So I think you will have a new type of, energy system where you will have large producers, but you will also have many small and actually micro level producers of energy. Germany and other countries have done this, for instance, where the number of producers who are also users has gone up tremendously. So I think the situation is changing, but I should also add here that companies need not only to think in terms of production of energy, but also the consumption. And I think there's a tremendous scope in demand-side management, both in the corporate sector as well as household and urban sectors. So I think we should see this problem together, both the production of renewables, but also the managing the demand side better.
Thanks for pointing out, the various sides to the renewable energy push, sir. One question in terms of, which is linked to closer collaboration in this sphere, is the role of the United Nations. Now, as someone who's been a stakeholder in the UN and, who's been awarded by the UN and, you've really witnessed it over the decades. It's a journey, not just the global south, but across the world. And, in the light of the Russia-Ukraine war, I was wondering what you made of the UN's work in the last few years. I know this is, again, another broad question and, there are many ways to answer it. But I guess the short question that I'm really asking you is do you think the UN is playing a constructive role in managing the climate crisis and as well as conflict resolution, given how, some of the events of the last few years that have really shaped the world as we speak?
As you rightly say, the United Nations can play a role provided some of the bigger powers all agree on what is to be done. When you have a situation like the Ukraine crisis now, it is extremely difficult for the United Nations to play that role. Even in terms of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the main forum on which climate change discussions and negotiations are happening, the actual change only happens when political leadership wants that change to happen. So in Copenhagen, for instance, they could not get an agreement, but they did get an agreement in Paris in 2015. But now when certain countries don't fulfill that, and in terms of the financial commitments, we find that most of the rich countries, the developed countries, are not fulfilling their targets. What do you do? How do you press it? There is a limited scope of pressing it legally. So there is major limitations. The United Nations, as it is currently, really happened after the Second World War. The League of Nations was before that, and that changed and transformed itself to the United Nations. But I think today the United Nations does need to go through a fundamental change in the way it operates. And as you know, India has, for instance, said that India's role as perhaps the most populous country in a few months from now, as a major economy, it cannot not be a permanent member of the Security Council, for instance. But it is not. Germany and Japan, again, because of their situation in World War II, they are out of it. While Germany is a very strong contender along with France and UK to be a member of that forum. So then there are other forums which are emerging where these decisions are taken, and G20 is one such forum, which, as most of our listeners would know, India is currently the president. And I think what our Prime Minister has done is he is changing the game there. He's actually pushing it to another level. G20, I don't think any of the countries previously which became the leader of G20 really did the type of thrust that we are doing today in India, which is having 200 plus meetings discussing each theme and trying to get the G20 to agree on some of these critical aspects. Now, if the G20 does agree, then to implement it through the United Nations is relatively easier. But if those countries don't agree, there is nobody else to really tell them about it. I think the COVID crisis was another example where I think globally we all realized that unless we react to it as a planet, as human race as a whole, you cannot really solve this country by country. But even then you can see now that with China's numbers going up, there are many fears about it. Should we prevent people from China going out? Then China reacts negatively to that. What is happening? So if you see the last couple of years, I think the United Nations has, to some extent, lost its ability to call to order things which are going wrong. A very simple example would be that everyone realizes that women's education and education as a whole does lead to tremendous benefits, but one of those major benefits is that it decreases population growth. Wherever you've had, even within India, if you take Kerala, you take Tamil Nadu, you take Maharashtra, the population rate of increase has come down tremendously, primarily because women's education has changed. Now in this sort of situation, you would say, how come in 2023 the world does not have enough funds to support education for all? How come in this 2023 we cannot ensure a certain basic food security for everyone, whether they are in a very poor country or not? Climate change adds to it, and this last COP27 focused on loss and damage. That many countries, especially say island nations and others, or other countries, Pakistan for instance, faced a major crisis, and this was broadly attributed.
Apologies, sir. I think the last part of your post was cut off because of the time constraints. But, to your point, I think it's very important that we build momentum in the areas that you pointed out, especially in the right to food and right to shelter and right to livelihood. Every human being is entitled to these basic needs and rights, regardless of geography. And your institution has played a pivotal role, the center, in creating awareness. And I'm so honored to have hosted you this evening on Swell. So it's been a privilege having this conversation, and I really hope to have you back here once again on the Think Tank Swellcast. Until then, thank you again, sir, and have a wonderful evening.